Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. I'm Callum Chase, a co-founder of the AI safety startup Contium and a writer and keynote speaker on the future of AI.
And I'm David Wood, a survivor from the early days of the smartphone industry who aspires nowadays to be a radical real-world futurist.
David and I are continuing our investigation into the implications of the economic singularity, the time when we need a new economic system because full automation by AI means people can no longer obtain the resources they need by doing jobs. Our guest today is Oliver Ritchie, the UK policy lead at the Future of Life Institute. Previously, Oliver was a senior fellow at the Institute for AI Policy and Strategy, and before that he spent 5 years in policy formation at the UK Treasury, which is where many of the brightest minds in UK public sector work, and where the really big decisions are made because the Treasury holds the purse strings. We wanted to have Oliver on the show because he's written 2 thought-provoking articles on the economic singularity, a paper called The Fiscal Challenge of Advanced AI, and a Substack post which summarises it called Can We Afford to Support Workers Whose Jobs Are Displaced by AI? So Oliver, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us, Oliver.
Your central thesis, Oliver, I think, is that AI could substantially expand the economy while leaving governments and citizens no better off, because the state may be unable to capture and redistribute enough of the gains. And you argue that Sam Altman's optimism that the AI boom will be so large that we can simply tax the surplus and support displaced workers may be misplaced. Tell us why.
Absolutely. I think that is a very good summary of my central thesis there. I have hope that we can achieve the positive outcome he describes, but my worry is that when you look from a fiscal perspective rather than just a pure economic perspective, you hit some challenges. So this is the idea that we're not just looking at how big the economy is and how much money there is overall, but how much of that government is able to access and redistribute to the people who need it. In a world where AI drives rapid growth by replacing people, we move money out of a very high taxed part of the economy, which is people's wages, and into a much lower taxed part of the economy, which is capital, which is also much easier for people to move overseas if they don't like any changes that we make to the tax rates. We end up with a world where less of the economy goes to the government, but at the same time, people may be losing their jobs, so their demand for benefits may be increasing. So at the time that the government needs more money to support the people who are losing their jobs, it's in fact getting less money. And this could lead to a very weird situation where all the headline economic indicators look very good and government thinks everything should be going very well, but people on the streets feel poorer and poorer and government departments feel tighter and tighter. And this seems like a scenario that I would like us to avoid if we can.
Tell us about why we can't just simply tax capital more.
Yes, it's a really good question. I think the solution, or part of the solution, may be to find a way to tax capital more. But one of the things I've already mentioned is this ease with which capital can be moved. People have jobs and they have lives and they have families. And if the UK changes its tax rates on labour, we're unlikely to suddenly all emigrate. Whereas if we increase taxes on the wealthiest people or taxes on business profits, they may well re-register elsewhere or move overseas. So that's one challenge. And I believe maybe the only solution to that is proper international cooperation on minimum tax rates. There's some really exciting efforts happening on that at the G20 level, but they are currently somewhat stalled. There's also the challenge of taxing AI. Increasing the tax on AI may be valuable, but economists will scream at me that if you increase capital taxation, you make capital more expensive. Cheap capital helps investing in the goods that help people be more productive. And so you risk a kind of a productivity trap where companies aren't investing in the tools that workers need to do their best work. And this could cause wages to fall and the economy to shrink in ways that don't fall into the trap mechanism. If human productivity is increasing, that means wages are increasing, that means taxes increasing, that means less people are out of work. This is really good. So we need to be investing in people and we need to be giving them the tools they need. And some of those tools might even be AI systems that aren't replacing people. So I think it's very hard to target what an increase in taxes would look like. The dream would be taxing AI systems that replace people, but how to define that and how to enforce it is a problem that I don't have the solution to.
A lot of people understanding all that come to the conclusion that the only kind of capital you really can't move abroad is land. And so the idea of a land tax is very popular in San Francisco these days. It always puzzles me because if you dump all the taxes onto land, then the value of land goes through the floor because nobody wants it anymore because it's not productive. I don't see how that can sustain an economy. Am I missing something about land tax?
I agree with your concern. I don't believe it's the whole of the solution. I think we do need to experiment with novel ideas like this. It does seem plausible the value of land goes down. Equally, I guess it depends how weird a scenario we're looking at. I'm somewhat skeptical of total economic singularity scenarios where in this kind of future era of hyperabundance. But in a world like that, if we imagine that is possible, when an AI can make almost anything, one of the few things that AI can't automate and do better and faster than people are positional goods. So goods where you have the best version of something and that's limited in quantity by some real world constraint, like the land next to the Thames in London. In a world with rapidly spiraling wealth and extremely wealthy people, there may be spots in the world that the value drives up to almost unimaginable degrees. That doesn't seem totally far-fetched if you first accept this apparently far-fetched idea of astonishingly rapid economic growth. I would imagine some land could get very valuable, and that may be enough to support some taxes. I agree with you that that's not the only way forward, and I agree that may not drive enough to support an entire population of people.
Before we get on to the really intriguing question of whether full automation is possible or likely, the problem with taxing heavily the most desirable spots on Earth is those desirable spots are going to be owned by the most powerful people in the world. And they are fairly famously hard to tax. Right now, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk pay no tax because they've worked out this clever system to do with loans. A partner in McKinsey pays quite a lot of tax, but the real uber wealthy pay no tax. And that is a situation that is repeated down history, and I don't really see how it's going to change very much. That strikes me as being a tricky one.
I completely agree. My hope is that if they want that land enough, they may have to wade into the deal.
Alternatively, they could just pay to elect the president that does what they want, which is what they recently did.
I do worry about that.
A slight variant on taxing the most wealthy is having public ownership of a portion of the most profitable companies. I think Donald Trump has talked about taking a 5% share of some companies. Other people have advocated that the most powerful AI companies should be at least partially owned by the governments so that they will have a share of the dividends. Is that something you've thought about?
Yes, and I love the idea in principle. One challenge I see in this is how to operationalize it well. I went back to the dot-com boom. In the early stages of the dot-com boom, if you invested in the fastest rising, biggest companies like AOL, like Ask Jeeves, maybe moving on to mobile phones, Nokia at the time, if you just picked the top winning companies then and invested a lot of money in them, you may not have very much money at all now. And I think the risk is, particularly in the context of incredibly rapidly moving technology like AI, it's not guaranteed that the current incumbents will be the incumbents even in 5 years' time. Maybe you can solve some of those problems with something more like a tracker fund than individual investments in companies. And some exposure to that kind of upside, I think, does seem very wise. My challenge is it's quite hard. If investing was easy, we'd all be taking this bet, I think. And exactly the right way to take this bet doesn't seem clear to me. But I think we should explore it.
That volatility question, I think, could be turned to our advantage. If people really studied history, they would see, as you've pointed out, that companies that at one stage seemed dominant and totally secure are subject to losing their positions. It's possible that some of the world's wealthiest people today might end up comparative paupers relatively soon. There have been some companies that have lost quite a lot of value in the last week or so. That means each of them, if they were self-interested, if they were truly self-interested, should be willing to enter into some binding agreement that somehow the fruits will be distributed regardless of who is in the top seat and who's not in the top seat. Maybe I'm a bit naive here, but why do we cooperate? In part, it's because we can't be sure we're going to be very well in the future, and we may need, our loved ones may need the help we can't provide by ourselves.
Yeah, I like this idea. I think if you could convince companies to buy into some kind of insurance regime of this kind, I think the version that the Windfall Trust has proposed, which if it was deliverable, I think would be wonderful, would be this proposal that if companies achieve a level of profit that we can all agree right now is totally extraordinary, that then they will promise to redistribute that. And I would love it if we could get them to commit that. And then if the time came, we could get them to honor that promise. I have some concerns that both steps may be difficult. In terms of insurance against risk, maybe this skates over the short-term thing that I'd maybe focus on a little bit harder, which is that if we're looking at enormous economic growth from these companies, it's partly because they're willing to take enormous risks. If what the founders of companies like Anthropic and OpenAI are saying is true, most of them seem to expect about a 1 in 5 chance that their work causes some kind of catastrophic global event on a level, they describe it differently, but human extinction or the collapse of society or something like that. A 1 in 5 chance of that is enormous. And the value implied by that, the economic cost of that, is certainly worth more than the value of all of these AI companies right now. And even if you multiply that cost by 1 in 5, just a fifth of that cost, the expected value of destroying civilization, it's still worth, I'm sure, more than the value of all of these AI companies right now. So you can argue that they're getting rich by taking unreasonable risks with the rest of us. And at least on a moral level, this is an argument I think we can and should deploy much more forcefully in saying, you should share the benefits of this because you are rich because you've taken risks on other people's behalves. I don't know how to operationalize that in terms of actually forcing them to comply. But in terms of the moral argument, I think it's clear that this is not fairly gotten gains.
To be clear, are you a fan of these people who are taking such a risk on behalf of the rest of us? Do you admire their boldness, or would you strongly wish that they could be constrained?
I don't admire them. I can't imagine anyone willingly saying that they think they have a 1 in 5 chance of destroying the civilization they live in, and saying that in words that imply they think they're kind of cool. I almost can't describe how hard it is for me to believe these are people as part of the same civilized society that I'm part of. I worry about parking on the side of the street and blocking access to someone's drive recently, and I worry about that later in the day. And they're saying, well, don't worry about the drive. The whole country might be in flames, but it's fine because it's also possible we'll make a big profit. I'm kind of astonished that people can say things like this in public and there isn't a bigger reaction.
I think you're being a little unfair. There is another bit to the argument that we haven't made explicit. It's a feature of people who become this successful, that they are very, very comfortable with risk. They will bet the farm over and over again, and they are people of extraordinary ability. The bit of the argument that we haven't unveiled is, yes, they think there's a 20% or 15, whatever it is, percent chance of extinction. But they also think that that is going to happen. They think it's inevitable. And they think the question is, who's going to do it? And they think, you and I might completely disagree with this, but they think that they are better custodians of this critical moment than the alternative. In the case of Sam Altman, I suspect he thinks the alternative is Elon Musk, and that's a mutual bidirectional judgment. In the case of Dario Amodei, it's very clearly China. Dario Amodei believes that if China introduces superintelligence to the world, it will be an utter disaster. And even though Anthropic introducing superintelligence means a 20% chance of utter disaster, he thinks it's a lot worse than the only possible alternative. They don't think the alternative is, let's pause, which a lot of people do think. They think the alternative is somebody else does it and that other person will be worse. It's a bit bonkers, I agree, but it's not completely immoral. If you accept their premises, which actually I don't, but if you do accept their premises, they're not being totally immoral and or stupid.
Yeah, we have to engage with these arguments. If they're right, then we should take that very seriously. Whether you can make a defense like this work depends on quite a narrow set of specifics about exactly how the future plays out, exactly what superintelligence really means for the world. And I think often their story in these collapse of civilization scenarios is that superintelligence is a more intelligent being than humans on the planet. And similar to the way that we make decisions about the future of chimps and chimps don't make decisions about the future of humans, this being would take that position for us. A good outcome might look like it thinks we're cute and fluffy and treats us like cats. The bad outcome might be it doesn't, and it gasses us like we gas pigs for meat. And maybe we're just flipping a coin and hoping that we're kind of cute. I'm a little skeptical of this way of thinking about superintelligence, but it's certainly a worry I have that this is a possibility. If that's the story, then it doesn't really matter necessarily who builds the first superintelligence, because the story is also that these superintelligences are modifying themselves constantly. Maybe there's some path dependency from a Chinese company making it first or an American company making it first. But ultimately, I think the story that China would make it first and then China would be in charge of the world and we'd enter this dystopian future requires enough superintelligence for it to take over the entire world, but not enough for it to outwit the Chinese Communist Party. And maybe there's this incredibly narrow band where that's possible, and they can kind of stop it developing itself any further once it reaches that incredibly narrow gap. But I think a simpler way of thinking about this is most forms of superintelligence, if this concept really does make sense and it really is this powerful, are going to evade our control and are going to define their own fate. And if anyone builds it, my guess is the way we kick off this process doesn't hugely affect the outcome. Probably very rapidly, we are not in control, and most of the outcomes are ones that I'm absolutely terrified of. And so if you think you might be able to create superintelligence, I really don't think it matters who builds it that much. Maybe it more matters how much time humanity has had to prepare before it appears. And therefore, slowing down a bit seems broadly sensible, even if you think you might get there first.
I completely agree with that. I think that's absolutely right. Actually, if we were a rational species, we would pause because we're taking a terrible risk collectively, and it's a dumb thing to do. It's just that we're not a rational species. We've got the prisoner's dilemma problem. We can't escape it. So we're going to do this. And as you say, once superintelligence arrives, assuming it is much smarter than us, we will become the second smartest species on the planet. We will be analogous to chimpanzees today, and we will not be controlling our future anymore. There is just one thing, and this is taking us into Kantian territory, but I do think that we've got a better chance of a good outcome if the first superintelligence is conscious, because that superintelligence could have empathy for us in a way that a zombie superintelligence couldn't. But let's not dive into that. Let's come back to the economic singularity issue, which by hypothesis arrives before the arrival of superintelligence. The AI which creates the economic singularity can do everything that humans can do for money, but it can't necessarily do everything that humans do completely. Actually, there's quite a lot to human life which is not about money. Now, you mentioned earlier that you're skeptical of the idea of full automation. And of course, we don't know whether full automation is possible. But it always seems to me that if we do keep improving AIs very fast, unless there is some silicon ceiling, some odd physical law that says silicon can't do things, you can teach silicon to think so far, but you can't teach it to become as competent as a carbon-based human. Or unless we do the sensible thing and introduce a pause, which I think we all agree we're not going to do, then it seems to me inevitable that we will be at some point in a position where machines, AI software plus robots, can do everything for money that humans can do. And yes, there might be some artisanal benefits. Some rich people may prefer to have something made by a human. But basically, everything that a human can do is going to be replicatable by a machine, which can do it cheaper, better, and faster. What is your skepticism about that proposition?
I would love to come back to the introduce a pause point as well. I don't agree that that's not possible. Maybe that's a point of real contention between us. But on this question, I agree that this is a possible future, and it's a future I worry about very much. My hope that we might not get there comes back partly to a question of what's the story here? And the story in the previous Industrial Revolution, which I know you've talked about before, people said it was going to be the end of jobs, and it wasn't, and this time might be different. The story might be something like the previous Industrial Revolution. Many humans earned work through their muscles and through their fine motor skills, and a lot of that was replaced by machines, but maybe not quite all of it. But we withdrew. Most of the new jobs that were produced were based on our intelligence, which was the remaining thing that humans had that machines didn't. Now the idea is, well, if we're also automating intelligence, has the lot gone? Is there anywhere else to withdraw to? One area of hope that I have is that there are jobs where a more intelligent human or a stronger human still wouldn't be better. So I have a 1.5-year-old son. I take him to the childminders every day, or most days. If the childminder was 100 times more intelligent, I'm not sure he'd do a particularly better job at looking after my son. And equally, he needs to be strong enough to lift 2 or 3 toddlers into a bike, but he doesn't need to be stronger than that. He is strong enough to do his job, and he is intelligent enough to do his job. Fundamentally, he is a human, And I personally wouldn't drop my child off with a robo-nanny, even if they were sort of technically safer and technically providing stimulating educational content. I personally wouldn't choose to. I'm sure some people would. The weak version of my claim is I'm confident some jobs should remain, particularly in these kinds of caring professions. You mentioned artisanal work. I expect if we've got some very wealthy people, we will have some demand for luxury, and some of those people may well have a strong preference for human-produced goods, at least some of the things they buy. Similarly, sports. If a load of robot footballers reach the level of Harry Kane, I would absolutely watch a robo football match for entertainment value. That sounds great fun. But I suspect I wouldn't spill my pint of beer all over the living room floor at 2 a.m. when we score a goal against Mexico with our robot team in the same way I do with our human team. And so I'm kind of optimistic that a section of human work should survive. I don't think intelligence is enough. I don't think you can reduce the remainder of what humanity does to intelligence. Whether that provides enough jobs for everyone to have a good standard of living is something I really do worry about. That may just simply be insufficient.
Okay, so I'm much less confident than you about the robo-nanny, but that may mean that I'm basically a robot and you're a nice, fuzzy human being.
Well, human nannies do make mistakes from time to time.
Exactly. Sometimes disastrous mistakes. Sometimes they kill children, which arguably a robot one wouldn't do. But anyway, it seems to me we're quite likely to have two economies. One for most people, where we're going to have some sort of central redistribution of revenues, of resources, because most people won't be able to earn a living. In the second economy, where original Vermeers and original Aston Martin DB5s are traded, and where some sort of fuzzy work goes on. I think you have two economies, and people can still get rich in the alternative economy, but most people will rely heavily on the main one. And what we really need, and we don't have, is a way of figuring out how the main one works when, by hypothesis, there are no jobs for almost all people, and all the revenue that the world economy generates is being generated essentially in Silicon Valley and in China. And we've got to figure out how to get those resources distributed evenly to the rest of the world. And that is a massively tricky problem. It's not insoluble. It's not a mathematically insoluble problem, but it's tricky, and we haven't begun to think about it. It seems to me that's where we need to apply a lot of brain power, which is currently not happening.
One response I have to this is the problem as you've described it does seem incredibly difficult. My current approach to trying to tackle this is to say, let's really be sure that there isn't a way that we can avoid getting there. It sounds like you're not convinced about the possibility of sort of a pause or a slowdown. I agree that that seems difficult, but in conversations I'm having, certainly with members of my family who do not think about AI on a day-to-day, week-to-week, or even month-to-month basis, I think few of them understood what I did for a living or why 6 months ago. And now they're starting to call me up and saying, why aren't we doing something about this? I can't see the benefits for me. Who is this benefiting? I think a groundswell of public opinion is really happening. I think it's further advanced in America. We're already seeing state-level bans on data centers. This isn't like hypothetical, maybe we'll get a ban. Some American states are already taking actions which will slow down progress. And we're only just starting to see proper breakthrough incidents like OpenAI's rogue agents hacking another company, probably breaking the law, but not being clear who would be held to account for the law being broken because it wasn't a human doing it. And people go, oh, this seems quite scary. So I think at the public level, there's a groundswell of opinion. To make this work, though, there's also the challenge of how do you actually enforce it? How do you make it happen? That seems harder. I do expect that people will want this and increasingly do want this. Can you actually make it happen just because people want it? That's not necessarily possible. There's many things that we want that we don't get. But people in AI companies have privately told me that they'd like to see a pause. And even like the heads like Hassabis, Amadei, etc., have all said, if the others do it, we will do it too. I don't have zero optimism that this is possible. But maybe that was a bit of a tangent from your question.
No, it's dead relevant.
I think it's a very important question. For the record, my P-pause is about 2/3, and it comes up and goes down. I see even Donald Trump is quoted in the BBC News as saying, we are looking at AI, we are looking at controls because of the concern about cyber hacking and vulnerability to foreign use of AI, especially if it's released as open source and then people can adapt it. And it's encouraging that in the Pacing the Frontier letter that came out recently, the ask there is let's develop the tools that will help us to monitor and govern the pace of progress. So we don't have these tools yet. We've got vague ideas what they can have, but if we applied a little bit of the vast brain power which is currently augmenting the capabilities in a general sense, if we could direct it more onto the defensive uses, the monitoring uses, we may discover that we could slow things down. Is that how you see it?
That's how I see it. I absolutely agree. And I think that the technical side of working out how to enforce that is one of the big, interesting, but probably solvable problems. Maybe the other part of it is how can we tell a positive story about slowing down? If it's just about taking away rich people's toys and slowing down the economy, I think it's very hard to sell. And I think there is progress on that side as well. Something I've been talking about a lot with colleagues at FLI recently is an idea of tool AI. Rather than trying to build general purpose systems, which carry a lot of the risks of replacing us, if we can design narrower AI systems, we can push capabilities further with less risk because they're less likely to do things we don't expect them to. Bridgewater, a big investment company, have fine-tuned a relatively small open source model to advise on trading. And it's outperforming even the latest OpenAI model on the specific task it's doing for a lower upfront cost and lower compute cost. Similarly, there's some progress on an avenue, I've got no idea if it'll prove good in the long run, of on-chip, hard-encoded LLMs. So rather than having software, you actually program the LLM into the transistors of the chip. So it can only ever work in one way. It's much harder to have recursive self-improvement, and you can test it safe, and then you're sure it's always going to work in exactly the same way. But inference times are about 10 times lower, energy costs are lower. Particularly for a country like the UK, where we're probably not going to be building the biggest frontier models, working out cheaper, faster ways to do a task really well, that may be where the profit margins are for us. It may not be about trading off economic growth against a slightly safer approach. It may be that the safer approach is actually better for our economy as well. And if that's true, that provides me with a lot of hope.
I applaud David's optimism. I applaud your attempts to find alternatives to the mainstream route that we're going down. And for the record, if it was possible to get everybody to agree to pause, it is what we should do. It's the sensible thing to do. However, there's two mindsets which I think will stop us doing it. One mindset is quite common in Silicon Valley, and it's the idea that all this stuff about extinction is science fiction, utter nonsense, can't possibly happen. And there are really smart people who believe this. Andrew Ng has been saying it and keeps saying it very loudly. Jan LeCun, I think he's wobbling a bit now, but he's traditionally been saying it. Mark Andreessen at A16Z, David Sachs, former Trump advisor on AI. These people all think that a future of superintelligent AI is going to be wonderful. It can only be wonderful. And all this stuff about extinction is nonsense and peddled by left-wing wibbly people. And the other mindset is actually more threatening, and that is, I don't care. And that's the mindset, I think, of Putin and of Kim Jong-un and of the mafia, and on a bad day, I think Elon Musk. And they simply don't care. They want more power, and they want it now, and they don't care what happens. Well, Musk may care about humanity. I don't think Putin does. And they will build superintelligence if they can. Now, I quite like Eliezer Yudkowsky's idea that we get everybody sensible in a room and say, we're going to have a pause. And if anybody breaches this pause, we're going to bomb you. Any data centers which we don't know exactly what they're doing and you can see them from space, we're going to bomb them. And that's fine for now. But in 5 years' time, those data centers won't be that big and you won't be able to see them from space and you won't be able to bomb them. So it seems to me that we are going to build superintelligence. We're on an inevitable one-way track. So unlike David, my P pause in the medium term is not much above zero, sadly. We should do it. We're not going to.
Maybe I can quickly respond to both of those angles. The wibbly-wobbly lefty accusation. I find both these arguments quite hard to make a really good version of. And secondly, you talk about people like Mark Andreessen at A16Z. He has an incredibly strong financial incentive in AI companies racing ahead. So I wonder how honest these arguments are. My kind of core concern with them is I could buy a claim that extinction won't happen because superintelligent AI is kind of science fiction or something like that. Some people think that, and I'm really worried superintelligence AI might be possible. I kind of hope it's not possible. And maybe there are some kind of limits we've not reached yet on getting there. Maybe it will be harder than we think. So the claim that we won't get there, I think, is an interesting factual claim. But once you've described superintelligence AI and assume it exists, you are describing something that's faster, brighter, stronger, better everything else, every other kind of superlative. That's kind of the definition. And once you've got there, it seems completely incoherent to say we can assume it'll be fine. It's almost like you're making a claim that this is ineffable. It is beyond our understanding, and yet we're making firm predictions about what it will and won't do.
There's a small point here, which is you could argue that if it is smarter, more capable in every way, it will also be better morally. I don't believe that's necessarily the case, but there are people who do believe necessarily superintelligence will be nicer than us. It'll be morally superior.
That would be wonderful. I'd love that to be true. Maybe we don't have time to dig into the details of why I strongly disagree. I think enough to say it's not obviously definitely true.
It's not necessary, yeah.
Plausibly true. Maybe. That would be nice. I would love that to be true. On the I don't care angle, and this is a depressing one, my hope here partly comes from the fact that we have the same people. You're listing Putin doesn't care. He hasn't deployed large-scale biological weapons. He hasn't deployed nuclear weapons in the Ukraine war.
Yet.
But the point is, we have solved problems like this that seemed intractable before. I think nuclear and biological weapons are both incredibly good examples, and they all got solved somewhat last minute. That seems to be how the international community works. It waits until it is impossible to do anything but act, and then it acts. And part of our role now is preparing the ground so that when that moment comes, there are good options on the table for the international community to grab. I don't know if a promise to bomb data centers from space is the right solution, but it's the kind of story we should be telling. We can be talking about economic sanctions. And Putin does care about things like his international prestige. He cares about being able to meet with other world leaders, a threat of ostracization and things like this. There are levers we can use and have used in the past. And I expect all we can do is try again.
So on the subject of telling stories, coming up with narrations, should we be developing stories about tax policy? Because it's one thing to say people should be focusing on figuring out how to make AI safe, but arguably a very under-researched field is new ideas in tax policy that will square the circles that we've talked about earlier. So do you have things in your article or new ideas that you'd like to advocate to the community so that they may pick them up and run with them and turn them into blockbuster movies? Their tax solution.
I'd watch that movie. I'd be the first in the queue. One of the core things here is the international dimension. The cop-out answer here is a lot of these tax problems on AI specifically are very, very hard to solve unilaterally at the nation state level. And the solutions, if you could secure international agreement for them, are actually pretty straightforward and pretty obvious. You set minimum tax rates to avoid capital fleeing between countries. You allow countries to set at least that tax level, and everyone's happy. The problem is getting those kinds of deals agreed. There's such a strong incentive to be the defector that all the capital flows to. We've seen that before on almost every similar attempt, particularly on corporation tax rates. So I guess one answer to your question is the solution is actually not the hard part, it's implementing it. Maybe the second layer is if you accept that the international solution is too hard, what can we creatively do at the domestic level? I do think the idea of land taxes is worth further consideration. I do think it's worth doing the detailed and difficult work of trying to work out if there's a way to more narrowly define the kind of economically unhelpful AI that's more or less just replacing people and separate that in a sufficiently straightforward, easily defined way from the very, very similar looking AI, which is augmenting people and that's very good for the economy. I suspect that to be impossible. That could take 50 people spending a year before we really conclude it's impossible. I hope some of the work of the new Treasury Economics Institute, and I think we've just announced a Minister for the Future of Work. These are the kinds of problems they should be focused on. I don't have the solutions there, but I think it's fertile ground to explore. And a final angle, which isn't quite tax, but is very closely related, is we've talked a bit about how big the market for remaining human jobs might be. There's more low-hanging fruit on helping that market grow quickly and flourish. So an example is clear verification standards for human produced. What does that mean? This doesn't need to be regulation. This can just be defined standards with enforcement protocols. But similar to the way that we say Parmesan cheese has to come from Parmesan and be made in a certain way, and that allows producers of Parmesan cheese to sell it at a greater margin. we should look into the best way to create similar standards for human produced. What does a human produced movie look like? What does a human written novel look like? What does human delivered childcare or education look like? I expect if those standards existed, I would personally be willing to often pay more for something with that badge, and particularly knowing that that protected jobs for other people. Maybe some people wouldn't, but if a proportion of the population is happy to, and maybe the more scarier AI gets, the more people will feel this is a cause that's important to them. This could help slow down the loss of jobs and protect the tax burden over a longer period. So I'm really excited by that. I don't know how big the benefit is, but it does seem just like a very easy to deliver, cheap win. We should do that for sure, ASAP.
Good. I agree with that. I have one final question. But before that, I just want to reiterate, I do applaud the work that FLI and other people are doing to try to create a pause, and I hope it works. I don't think it will, but I hope it works. What's really still missing? You're talking about developing plans for various scenarios, and we should do that. One of the scenarios that we're just hardly looking at all is what do we do if we get full automation? How do we get all the resources for everybody to have a good standard of living if all the money is being earned in Silicon Valley and China and there are no jobs for the rest of the people? There was a letter recently signed by Krugman and Stiglitz, which was the first time I've seen any economist saying that the future of really advanced AI is interesting and scary, and that governments should wake up and pay more attention to it. I thought it was slightly cheeky. The economics profession has been in total denial about this possible scenario for such a long time. And now, if they're going to finally wake up, they should at least say, oops, we haven't had our eye on the ball at all. Instead of which they're saying, oops, politicians haven't had their eye on the ball. But the economists are not there as a profession yet. They're not all saying, wonder if we could have an economic structure which would work in that scenario. And we need them to be saying that. We need them to be making plans for it. How do we wake the economists up?
How do you wake the economists up? That is an excellent question. One possible answer is throwing a sufficiently interesting framing of this question at them. One way I frame this problem is in a full automation scenario, if we get there, if humans are fully disempowered, I just don't see how, from more of a political economy perspective, you can create a stable system where even if there's for some time some UBI or something, I can't see how that remains stable for long. If the people with the power don't have the interests for that system, it doesn't seem like we can be sure it will survive. A really interesting question that maybe cuts across economics and political economy is how do you ensure that humans remain empowered in this scenario? And one answer that I would pitch is that we need it to remain true that there are rights and powers that humans have that we don't give to AI systems. A kind of separate line of work is whether AI systems, we could speed up the economy by letting them sign contracts and have their own personhood and have their own sort of legal responsibilities. This maybe seems like a pretty open question whether that happens or not. And the future where we give these kinds of rights to AI systems seems unimaginably harder to make go well for humans once we reach this future point. And the question right now is, what rights should we start handing over to AI systems? So maybe a very immediate challenge we could get economists to stick their teeth into is, how can we allow this economic growth to continue whilst retaining as many rights as possible with humanity, such that we don't get into a future where we realize that approximately in July or August 2026, we handed away the keys to our future because we handed over things like rights to personhood to AI systems, even if this is long before the economic singularity. And maybe that's a way to really push this up the agenda. The decisions we're making this year may end up being the ones that shape the kind of future we can have once we reach that future point. If we could convince people of that story, that feels like a question that should be extraordinarily motivating.
That sounds like it's connected to the earlier idea you championed of tool AI. AIs that aren't hugely general, they're narrowly targeted to particular tasks, and there's no risk that they're going to develop any volition, any independent thinking, which people like Yoshua Bengio have been advocating. I think he calls it scientist AI. But people like Roman Yampolsky say, well, the best specific tool is a general tool. That's often the way, because tools in the real world have got to solve general problems. And also, the best tool is one that will figure out how to get more resources for itself, even if you try and avoid that. I wish we could do more research on this. There could be a solution here, but I don't think it's going to be an easy one.
I don't think it's going to be an easy one. Oliver, fascinating discussion. We've ranged far and wide, and it's all been dead relevant, so it's all been a lot of fun. Thank you very much indeed for joining the London Futurist podcast.
Thanks very much. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you.